Hi, everyone.
All right.
Foresight's Biotech and Health Extension Group, sponsored by 100+ Capital. As I already said, off the record, this is a little bit of a different event. We used to have these a lot, where it was more like an open brainstorm with a group that was a little bit more about, I guess, ecosystem factors in the field. Recently, we've done much more of the technical presentation, so I'm really happy that we get into the brainstorming mode again. Thanks. I couldn't imagine to do that with anyone better than Kalon and Tom, who are here. To provide like some context on how this meeting came about. Kalon and Tom are not longevity scientists, but they have been working for a really, really long time on trying to basically pave the like legal and general institutional pathways for making innovation that's crucial for human flourishing easier, and have recently set their eye on longevity. I think you guys got a grant from Emergent Ventures, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Work, and it is basically on finding out which countries and jurisdictions are good for longevity, trying to create a little bit more common knowledge around this so that regulators are aware and that other countries can maybe act on that and so forth. But they will tell you all about it. One thing that I will say is that they have come up with a few questions that they would really, really love you guys, which are mostly technical folks in this group, and also folks with significant legal and policy experience, I see, that they would love your ideas on. So I'm going to share a Google Doc here with you. It would be absolutely wonderful if you guys are interested in commenting on it, but at the same time, we also just want your ideas in the chat or here during the meeting. And we're going to do all the cleanup and try to condense it into something that's actually legible. But I'm going to give the mic to Kalon and Tom to just give you a little bit of an intro of like, what are they doing? What would we love your brain power on? And I'm going to be in the chat in case there's any more questions. And I see a bunch more people joining. So I'm going to stay in the chat for now. So Kalon, Tom, thanks so much for joining. The stage is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Allison. That was a fantastic introduction. So we put together kind of a brief presentation for you kind of to kick things off. So I will share my screen. So this project began earlier this year. Tom and I kind of met while we were working on a project in the special jurisdiction space. Initially, we set out to figure out, what were some of the best jurisdictions or jurisdictions most favorable to the longevity movement, to translational geroscience. And we quickly found that in fact there was very little consensus as to what constitutes the best public policy, what are the best ways that law and regulation can support translational geroscience to the extent that they can. And a few months after kind of brainstorming, doing some initial review of both the literature and sort of this interviewing process, we received some funding from Tyler Cowen's Emergent Ventures to study precisely this question. What are the best policies for translational geroscience? So just to provide a little bit of background here. So, I think that I think we all generally recognize that there are probably some significant policy issues, maybe standing in the way of translational geroscience. But to the extent that this is recognized, right, our initial review has sort of revealed that even within the longevity community, right, we still have to determine, precisely what that best policy might be. So what we've taken so far in terms of our approach is kind of to combine a classic kind of academic lit review with interviews that you might see in kind of a market research, private sector context. We've had these conversations with leading scholars, various executives and entrepreneurs in the longevity space. We are hoping to speak with a few regulators in the coming months as well. Sort of notoriously hard to get in front of, but we're trying our best. We're then going to compile all of these suggestions, policy prescriptions into what we're calling a reform ontology. We sort of piece the scaffolding, if you will, of that ontology together from a few comparative law and sort of consulting McKinsey type reports on the drug commercialization process generally. And I also want to note, and certainly Allison prefaced this, but we are at kind of the earlier stage of the project. So we're open to feedback, suggestions, criticisms, and all sorts of brainstorming to sort of better inform and improve our approach. Additionally, if you would like to participate as an interviewee, we would love to hear your thoughts on, you know, how, how your experience working at the intersection of biotech innovation and public policy has been, what your ideas for reform might look like. So with that, I'll kind of move into our initial findings. So, after we read through a few key papers and held our first few interviews, there are kind of two categories I think that began to emerge. There's sort of the whole set of pre-approval reforms and then post-approval reforms. And then here on the x-axis, you can think there's the sort of general reforms and then the Gero-specific reforms. And, just a few caveats. I do think, obviously the approval process is in serious need of reform, broadly speaking. But I also think as a movement, we shouldn't overlook some of the politically achievable post-approval victories that the longevity movement could win, right? For example, if we were able to somehow reform consent laws so that for non-risky health span related trials of approved drugs, right, if the clinical consent was treated as, for example, an extension of research consent, things like off-label validation studies could be streamlined, rapidly scaled, and in many cases automated entirely, right? So there's sort of an example of pretty politically achievable reform, post-approval, and it could help us all out a whole lot. And then I think the same qualification applies to the x-axis, but sort of general specific demarcation. Um, you know, I think as our research continued along, after that first pattern emerged, we began to construct a more mature reform ontology, which is sort of what I'm calling this schematic here. On a really basic level, you get kind of the preclinical, early development processes all the way down to post-approval. We borrowed this schema kind of by combining a McKinsey report on integrated evidence plans and then a legal report that compared pharmaceutical laws and regulations across actually a set of developing nations. As you can see here, we found about 10 Gero-specific reforms so far that we've kind of been able to distill from the literature, from the interview. We can go through them after the presentation if there's sufficient interest, but I won't go into all of them here. And again, to reiterate, this doesn't necessarily include kind of big general reforms that could accelerate biomedical innovation in the face of drug development across the board. Tom, do you want to add anything?
I'll just say thanks, Kalon, for getting things started. And I have to apologize for showing up late. It's for a good reason. I'm actually at the Lundquist Institute today. I'm in the TRIM-X thymus regeneration study, and this is my post-therapy evaluation. We're going to see if I lost years. And the only thing I'll add is Kalon, as usual, is doing his excellent job. He's very calm and methodical. He's younger than me too. So I want to stress that I feel personally some urgency, as maybe some of you do, to get geroscience out of the labs and out in the world helping people. And we think maybe you can help us do this. I don't think you'd be here if you didn't care about that also. And let me add that it's not just for me personally, but of course, there's a lot of people in need of these therapies once we get them figured out. So thank you, Kalon. He set it up great. And I think he has a little more to say. And we're going to invite you to give us some great ideas so we can get this paper done and maybe actually make some reforms in the real world. Back to you, Kalon.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so just to kind of make some final remarks on the future of the project. We do have, very, very excitingly, we have a few collaborations in the pipeline at the moment. We're kind of taking some of the insights that we've found so far to help write um, clinical trial regulations for a few firms that we've sourced from our network in the special jurisdiction space. So this is kind of, it's very exciting because kind of these ideas that we've distilled from these papers and interviews are going to find their way and ideally find their way into practice, into actual regulations in the coming months. We also are open to working with lobbying policy groups, although I'll have one qualification there. Timeline wise, we're looking to get a circulating draft of the report out early October. If you are interested in, receiving the circulating draft within the next month and a half or so, just include your name and email in the chat, and we can add you to the list of recipients. Otherwise, the final draft is going to be done at the end of this year. And then with respect to the clinical trial special jurisdiction project, we're looking at late January as kind of the completion of the first stage of that project. So if you are interested in, maybe you offer a really interesting reform, it makes its way into the report, and then you're interested in seeing if it kind of pans out in this project, it gets put into practice. Certainly feel free to reach out to us then. My contact info is on that first slide. And with that, I will conclude. There's some sort of just conversation spark questions that we'll leave you with.
Wonderful. Thank you. Maybe before we get into the Google Doc, which I just shared in the chat, are there any clarifying questions that people may have that are important just for you guys to understand what Kalon and Tom are up to? Any questions? Raise hand or say in the chat if you can't unmute. Yeah, I have a raised hand from Tom. Is that correct?
Yeah. Great to see the progress that you've made so far. I guess one question I have is whether in the course of doing the interviews, you have seen other concrete proposals like the idea that the folks who are working on the team trial came up with, that the FDA seemed open to, which is developing a composite endpoint that is associated with the delay of the onset of multiple chronic diseases. So I think that was a lot more effective than just saying, oh, you should make, aging an indication, which is something that you hear from the community. And I think that there's a lesson in this, which is rightly or wrongly, the FDA is more likely to respond to concrete proposals as opposed to sort of general aspirations. So I think that this is an interesting idea. The team trial has had a difficult time raising the money that they've needed. So that's a separate issue. But I think the notion of a composite endpoint that is associated with the delay of multiple chronic diseases is a good example of something that the FDA can and should get behind. And I'm wondering whether or not in your interviews you've surfaced ideas that have that level of specificity and concreteness, which in my view are more likely to get traction.
Kalon, I'll have to say, I don't remember anyone in our interviews so far specifically raising composite endpoints. You can correct me if I'm wrong. We have gotten some great suggestions that are very detailed. Just, I don't think I've heard that one yet. Kalon, do you agree?
Yeah, I think there's been some talk of, when we interviewed them, I think some of the kind of sarcopenia, frailty people were suggesting like dynamic biomarkers. Is that something similar to what you're describing, Thomas?
I think it's different, but there is work going on in EMEA, which, as you know, is the European equivalent of the FDA, around better biomarkers for frailty.
Okay. Okay.
And I put a link in the chat to language that is in the Senate and, equivalent language in the House, with guidance to NIH, NIA, and FDA. And the FDA language is on creating regulatory pathways and working with the private sector on biomarkers.
Yeah, just to state Tom's point more abstractly, FDA wants to be able to measure something to know if it's working. So saying, oh, aging should be an indication is a good vague sentiment, but it's not actionable by FDA, because in order to prove something, they want to measure something. And so anything that's sent to them for approval has to show something you can measure, and a composite endpoint would be a great example.
How about we hear from Larry, who just raised his hand and can maybe provide more context on the FDA? Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, I work at FDA, but I'm certainly not speaking on their behalf. I'm not in the Office of New Drugs or anything. But I mean, people always talk about disease in a drug, but the definition also includes function. If you can improve the function of something or decrease the lack of function. So I think what you really need, and what I think, is a consistent set of functional tests. I mean, the FDA a lot of times says, what's your 6-minute walk? Thing. I mean, you look at patients and see how far they can walk in 6 minutes. Do you have an immune system test? If you give somebody influenza, how do they respond to it? I think looking at more for a consistent battery of functional tests that can be measured, and then showing that you either don't decline or you improve in them, with some intervention would be sufficient. I think focusing on calling aging a disease, I think, you're going to get into all kinds of arguments about that, so I think, improving function of people. I mean, like we approved the Alzheimer's drug, and, but people say it didn't improve the function. They could be right. And biomarkers, are always, I mean, they've worked in some situations, like for HIV and other things, they've been very good. But, for other things, have we been misled or led? I mean, I don't know sometimes. Until you get the actual functional results, you really don't know if, getting rid of beta amyloid did any good or not.
It's great stuff. Thank you. Keep it coming. I'm writing it down.
Okay, any specific comments?
But again, I'm not speaking on behalf of FDA. This is my own personal opinion, Yeah.
This is all only personal opinion in these meetings. But I think that's why they're useful. So maybe we go back to the question that you said in conclusions. Like, I know that we have this very, very long Google Doc with a bunch of questions, but maybe we start with the broad ones, Kalon, that you highlighted in your conclusion first, just to see if we have any takers for that. One of them was which interventions you'd recommend, right? To be
any of their own, ideas for reform, policy prescriptions.
Yeah, like we couldn't be more broader on this. Okay, we have one from Abdul Kader. Go for it.
Yes, I think what's important is also there is a lot of manifestations during the aging that are considered subclinical, although they show deterioration, age-dependent deterioration of functions, but they are considered subclinical. So it's very important to define or redefine what's subclinical, what's a target, what's a legitimate target is. For example, we have continuous deterioration in the lung of aging individuals, but most of that is not considered really as a disease, and it's not considered clinically warranting a solution. So however, it does affect the life quality of people. So can we actually push the FDA into declaring that this is a target for solutions and improvements or not? That's a question that I have.
Noted. And if anyone, wants to chime in at any point with additions or with, like, hey, +1 this, or actually I want to make a modification, just go for it.
Well, let me suggest that the history of the FDA and the drug approval process is defined by that exact example of defining a pathology and a remedy for that pathology. So you're saying that this is a disease, and as evidence, you offer that you can mitigate it. Again, that's not necessarily true. If you look at the definition of an active ingredient, it says any or to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals. I mean, so, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a disease. I mean, this is the FDA's own definition out of the CFR. And, there's a second part of it. People just usually focus on the first part of it, but, the second part would be, you could submit applications based on that. And again, what I think is to have, a consistent set of functional tests, and certainly a lung test would be one of them. And as long as, there's all kinds of, there's no shortage of subjects for these type of trials. I mean, we're all aging, there a lot of people would participate in this stuff, I mean, you just have to get, a consistent set of functional tests, I think. And that's always been the problem with a lot of times when drugs come in, or, they're not consistent across companies or across other things. But when you have those consistent tests, you can make a decision.
I think
can I just pose, can I just pose one thing to Larry? Larry, what do you make of, and Greg, if you want to chime in, what do you make of Greg's comments in the chats, about, repealing, keep over,
No, I think effectiveness, there's so much chicanery out there, I think effectiveness is really needed. I mean, we approve drugs that sometimes don't work, and it takes us forever to pull them off the market. In Europe, they pull them off a lot faster, and people spend a lot of money on this stuff, and, if they're not getting any benefit, I mean, you feel a little bit ripped off, or the government's, so I think effectiveness is really very important, and again, when you say something, there's oftentimes choices for drugs. I know in cancer trials, people who volunteer in cancer trials, I mean, they could be foregoing a good treatment. And, so I mean, you still need effectiveness trials. And, that if we could be criticized for anything of late, is that we've been too loose on some of that lately.
I think there is an important angle to subclinical treatment of subclinical cases. I think the word for that is prevention. You have to move the FDA into conceding that improving status quo of people, even on a subclinical level, you are preventing diseases from happening. And if you can convince the FDA that there is a prevention aspect of a treatment in aging, I think that would be a great advance, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, the statins were approved based on prevention and things like that. So, I mean, there's a lot of precedents for prevention, approval of drugs for prevention. If you have a biomarker you think is, indicative of preventing something, then yeah, I mean, they have a.
Larry, did we lose you?
Micah, do you wanna jump in? Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you guys again as well. So something that kind of worries me about this approach of pushing the FDA to change the rules is the FDA is basically the largest and most likely to be the slowest to change of the regulatory organizations in the world. in terms of medical regulations. It seems like bang for your buck wise, you'd get more leverage by picking some country that has a much more agile regulatory agency and getting them to change their policy. So if you're going to spend $10 million lobbying, go spend $10 million lobbying in Malta or some, I don't know, I don't know anything about Malta. I'm just throwing a country out there that's smaller and has, their own regulatory agency that doesn't just copy the FDA. So a lot of them do just copy the FDA, and then spend that $10 million convincing them to change their policies and then move the research there. Now, of course, not all research can move there. And picking that country is hard. You have to pick a country that has the infrastructure to do the research, it has access to the scientists. Ideally, you want something that's kind of close to where the scientists already are. You don't want them to have to travel around the world for this. But I just worry that, getting the US government regulatory agencies to move is a very long and slow and expensive process. Whereas getting some, Caribbean island nations regulatory agencies to move is simple and easy. And so maybe there's some country out there that has the right mix of they have the infrastructure, they have access to the scientists, and they don't have a giant behemoth of regulatory agency that can't move quickly. Just something to think about in terms of where are we spending the resources? Is the right place to spend those resources?
Micah, as usually you're ahead of the curve. I think Kalon mentioned this, that we are working with a special jurisdiction that's interested in cultivating medical tourism, and we might end up helping them draft some regulations. That's one reason we want to do this research. But let's keep in mind what we're told we have to keep in mind, and that is getting access to the U.S. market eventually. It's hard to finance the development of these therapies unless you have the prospect of a big market. So tentatively, the goal is to come up with great regs that ensure safety and let scientists do their great stuff in a smaller jurisdiction that's actually inviting us, to help them. And then we'll see what works, and hope all works great. And we get data from that, or the researchers and scientists get data from that they can take to the U.S. and that the FDA will accept, and the EMA and other jurisdictions with big markets.
Yeah, my current theory is that we are. I mean, maybe I'm just too much of an optimist here, but my theory is that we're close enough to addressing aging that once we do successfully address it, like we will not have to convince anybody to change. When everybody in Dominican Republic is living to 200 years old, the FDA will change. Like that is not going to be a problem. Or when you've got 90-year-olds that are playing professional athletic sports and winning world championships, that's something that people will notice. Now, this may be just me being young and naive and optimistic, and maybe we are much further away from addressing the root cause of aging. And in which case, I think you're probably right. You do need to kind of find a path that will get you to the US eventually. Whereas if we are, in fact, very close to curing aging, or at least mitigating it enough that it's very visibly noticeable, then I think that the rest of it kind of just falls into place. You don't even need to worry about hitting the US or Europe, because they will just have to come along for the ride, because if they don't, they'll be left behind. So I think what it comes down to is a level of optimism versus pessimism. I fully acknowledge I may be very wrong here. So
we have one comment from Steve, and then I'll read out a few things in the chat just to get people's opinions on them from what other people have said.
There is kind of an elephant in the room regarding the difference between a drug and an over-the-counter dietary supplement, at least in the U.S. market. And so there may be a hybrid strategy of finding a therapeutic agent that can be sold in the United States as a dietary supplement, but in order for it to be, in a sense, approved and recognized and acknowledged for its anti-aging effects, it may need some kind of approval in some other country as a drug. And that may be one way to, in a sense, have something be a dietary supplement and kind of equivalent of an off-label kind of use in the United States, is to have that kind of finding of medical benefit in another country, not just in the United States where the FTC or the FDA may discount it, but to actually have approval in some other country.
Any comments from other folks in the group? I get a thumbs up here.
I actually just have one question before we move to the chat that I want to pose to everyone. And I think that the post-approval, pre-approval framework is somewhat helpful in reasoning through some of these things. And I'm curious if anyone has any sort of policy suggestions for the sort of post-approval side of things, particularly kind of in the payer and insurance context? Are there any kind of big reforms there that you might expect to, to speed up the commercialization or sort of just broadly financial support of these new kinds of medicine? John?
Hi. The, can you all hear me okay?
So,
Yep.
Okay. I just wanted to agree with Steve's comment. I've been following very interestedly an old variant on thiamine, vitamin B1, that was brought through phase 2 clinical trials for heart disease and breaking crosslinks in the extracellular matrix. And I wonder if that could be brought on the market as a dietary supplement, because the company that was sponsoring it 20 years ago went out of business. And wondering whether it has some medical benefits as well. The old name was ALT 711 or Alagebrium. Any comments on that?
Well, according to the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, the compound has to be found in nature. And I don't know that the Alagebrium is in that category. There's some very bizarre findings of finding trace quantities of things in plants and exotic species and stuff that might be useful to actually go looking for, finding ALT 711 in a natural source. But I think one of the things that I'd like to see considered is this fundamental conflict, economic and regulatory conflict between proprietary substances and generic substances. And it seems to me that one of the dangers that we face is that when we're dealing with a biological context like aging, where, nutrition and minerals and metabolism is based on fundamentally on generic compounds, that if some of the industry develops an economic incentive for criminalizing access to those supplements, that there may be, in a sense, conflict where one part of the industry, life extension industry, wants to shut down dietary supplements and generics, and another part of it is violently in opposition to it.
okay. Any immediate comments on Steve's point?
I had a question about the labeling of things as a supplement. You said it had to be found in nature. Does it have to be natural in nature, or can I just genetically engineer a plant, go plant it outside, and then someone stumbles upon it and finds it, and it has the exact drug that you're taking? Does that count?
If they didn't catch you, that would probably work.
Okay. Well, I
It
thought
just
we do now.
it just says that, we're talking about, for example, herbs and extracts of herbs are part of that definition. And so anything that falls into the category of nature and herbs and stuff, which is basically plant, compounds, and call them phytotoxins or whatever, that those are all considered part of that market. Now, the FDA has put a twist on that too, in terms of defining a new category of a new dietary supplement, which does have an approval burden.
Well, Micah, you kind of just made this impossible because you're on record and you will do this. So whenever I do find one of these in the wild, I know who placed it there. Okay, I'm going to read out just to make sure that these things don't get dropped and people have a chance to pick up on them if they want to. A few things from the chat. I read them out anonymously. But one comment was, I would create a mechanism to supplement disease-specific clinical trials so that they can also be useful to geroscience, especially in the discovery and validation of biomarkers, including biomarkers that can be used for surrogate endpoints. And then that same person said, I'd also like to see more collaboration between the geroscience community and the regulatory science community, which has centers of excellence at Stanford and UCSF, Maryland, and Yale, Mayo, and so forth. Any immediate comments, feedback, plus ones? Okay, then let me go to a different one just to have it all kind of like nicely done. So there's another one of just the purpose of the FDA, and that's, that it should be there to not to save consumers money, but to save lives. And the 1962 amendments have increased costs by 40-fold, have not improved safety, have not improved efficacy, and have shortened millions of lives by delaying the approval of life-saving drugs by many years and by precluding the development of many therapeutics that would otherwise have become available. And so are there any comments to that? I think that many people, this group, I'm assuming, are on board with that. But I think if we want to mostly move to proposal stage, maybe Mike, if you here and want to unmute and read out yours or make the comment.
Hello, how you doing? Yeah. So yeah, I was wondering if it is if you think it's reasonably feasible or wise to promote the modification of their mandate to, instead of just ensuring that all drugs are safe and effective, to maximizing healthy human lifespan. Because if they were to fulfill their mandate perfectly, that would require just driving the cost of any new intervention to infinity, to avoid avoid any drug ever being unsafe or ineffective. Do you think that is a reasonable goal or too ambitious?
Any comments, suggestions?
Mike did ask, is that possible? And I'll say, not quickly, I bet, with the FDA, but there could be other jurisdictions. And somebody else from the audience wanted to speak.
I was going to say basically the same thing. I think that with the FDA, chances of that happening are very, very low, but another jurisdiction, you might be able to pull that off. And I think it's very reasonable. I think your assessment is accurate.
Cool. Well, is there anyone else wants to make?
Well, I think, Allison, a lot of people may have a misconstrued vision. I'm not trying to defend the FDA. We make a lot of mistakes. I mean, and I can, give you a long list of them. But at least for drug approval, I think you look at HIV, it really changed a lot of thinking at FDA about approving things faster and working with the government and really, the government, it's an unbelievable success story with HIV. You have more drugs than you almost need. I mean, there's so many regimens that work that, people are staying alive for a very, very long time with HIV when it was, a death sentence and everything like that. And I think advocacy groups like ACT UP, did a great job in bringing the government along to that. And so I think, with aging, you have a much larger constituency. And, I think, getting people, excited about trying, getting people into trials and excited about something like this wouldn't be that hard. I mean, it's just getting stuff that, you think, I mean, you look at how much money is spent on face creams that supposedly prevent aging of faces, it's a tremendous amount of money. And, so the market is out there, and it's just getting consistent data, getting a setup to have consistent functional test. I would go with, instead of to validate biomarkers is tough and things like that. And eventually you may be able to do that. But if you just show, people's lung function doesn't decrease on something, and it really looks like it's real. I think the FDA, the Office of New Drugs, would consider it. I mean, I'm not in the Office of New Drugs, but I think they would. And, but that's, they're not really stopping cures, as far as I know. We may be doing things we shouldn't be doing, as far as, there might be some regulatory capture and things like that with some companies, but I don't think we're stopping cures.
So just to push back slightly on one thing you said, I think you're right. There is a lot of money out there. I'm not convinced the money is in the right hands. I think there's a lot of money in like the big pharmaceutical companies and whatnot, and the skincare industry. But the people who are trying to cure aging tend to not work for big pharma or skincare companies. They work for these small startups that, as an investor, they're constantly struggling to raise money to just get their phase 1 trial. Like it's just so expensive to even take the first step. And then once they take the first step, then almost every company that I talk to about investment, like their path is to somehow get acquired by a pharmaceutical company so they can fund getting through the rest of the phases of the trial. And of course, if you get funded by the pharmaceutical company doesn't necessarily have the interest that the initial researchers did to cure aging. They have the interest in making money. That's their job, their business. And so I worry that while I agree there are many people who can afford the cost of FDA trials, I'm not convinced that people who can't afford the cost.
I think that's a real good point. I think the cost of the trials is far too high, and and how to get them, cheaper. I think there's a lot of ways to do that. Particularly with functional tests, with a cell phone, you can measure distance that somebody walks in 6 minutes. You can. I mean, I'm involved in a clinical trial now, and all my things are over the cell phone. I ask, every twice a week I get a thing to ask and to respond to, and so I think there's ways to do less expensive trials. Especially phase 3 or things like that. Once you've shown something is safe and you have a dose, and I think that's the way to go. I agree that clinical trials are way too expensive, and sometimes the FDA asks for too much, or companies think they have to provide too much in a trial, and so they do. But yeah, I mean, the cost of clinical trials has to come down. And there's there was the lithium trial that I forget, it was muscular dystrophy or one of the other things that was done online by patients who have it. And so I mean, I think there's other ways to organize trials than the big pharma model, and there's even new clinical trial designs. I don't know if you follow the work by Ed Mills and Laura Esserman out in Stanford, and who are doing more platform trials where you don't have if you have a placebo arm, you're running against 5 or 6 different things. And so I think the cost of clinical trials and the data of clinical trials has to come down, and the data has to be made more available. I mean, I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out what's in a given clinical trial, and if it's done in Europe or outside of the US, I mean, I don't know what they really even used. And so I think a lot more transparency in clinical trials should be there. I think before a company even begins a clinical trial, they should make the physician's brochure public. They should make what they're testing public.
Yeah. I'm Googling them right now. Thanks for suggesting them, Larry. And let's see if we can maybe get them to join and speak a little bit about their platform design. And okay, I think in the interest of time, we have to move on. So we had one question in the chat that got quite a lot of engagement of like, what other jurisdictions are currently being considered. Maybe if people have ideas on this, go for it. I know that we, for example, once had a meeting on Singapore as like a jurisdiction, at least where apparently the private sector is working rather closely with the governmental sector, and like there's at least like some technical understanding on that end to push those technologies forward. But if there's anyone who wants to make a case for a specific jurisdiction where they think it's good to look, now at the time.
John Ferber, would you like to elaborate on why I think Mexico is interesting?
Well, Mexico has a history of clinics in and around Tijuana and also in the Cancun area. And so it's interesting in the sense that there is precedent there.
Cool. Other proposals here include Panama, then Prospera, Costa Rica, and a few others. So if any of you have additional ideas, please keep them coming. I think one question that's kind of like related to this one is one that's the first one on the brainstorming doc that we have. And I think it's actually a good one to kick off discussion, because many people here are great people to ask that to, which is it's the question number 2. what matters for you most when you would choose a jurisdiction for your geoscience work? And I think this is, like, if you had a total, like, freedom of movement, where would you go? What criteria are really important for you to decide? Does anyone have any ideas? Too broad? Okay, then let's try it with, would anyone care to share about different IP regimes and strategies that have impacted work in your, and that have impacted your work? If you could wave a magic wand and at least change a few of the IP regimes that you're currently under, what would be a few that you'd go for?
I'll just offer this from some interviews that Kalon and I have conducted. We've heard from some researchers that they prefer working outside of the United States in jurisdictions, which is most of the jurisdictions, where there's no patent coverage from a U.S. patent. Of course, if you get outside of the United States, there's no U.S. patent coverage, and usually, Big Pharma doesn't bother to patent their protected drugs all over the world. So you can go to another country and start using compounds that are patented in the United States freely with no legal liability. So that's an interesting example from the real world where people are already, I won't say dodging. I mean, what they're doing is perfectly legal, but avoiding the effect of U.S. patent laws. They see them as a hindrance.
Allison, I'll just jump in here quickly. Hi, Tom. It's nice to see you again. It's been a long time. I think all of this stuff really matters. The regulations matter. The IP stuff matters. But something that often matters even more is where the capital is. And, a lot of companies are in the US and they're not going to leave the US because this is where this is where their ecosystem is. This is where their labor is. This is where their capital is. They've got a lot of support systems here. So it's not like they're going to move on a single issue. Like sometimes they will. Like, a number of companies I work with do their clinical trials, for instance, outside of the US. They're doing them in Australia. They're doing them in China. They're doing them they're doing them all over in Mexico. And so, that kind of stuff happens. But it's not to say that it's not important. It's incredibly important for the IP to be right and the regulations to be right. It's just that it's sometimes not enough for somebody to jump jurisdictions, as I'm sure you're aware. I just thought I'd throw that out there, though.
Sonia, do you have any insight into maybe on the post-approval side, because the market access, the whole payer and insurance situation, right, kind of shapes the kind of the incentives around and where investors are looking and what kinds of projects you're looking to finance. Do you have some insights or suggestions on that front?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think sometimes that's one of the biggest things for a company, actually, is how do they get paid, right? And so if they can figure out how to get the system to pay, and oftentimes they can, and sometimes that's a very easy thing for them to do, easier than trying to get the IP system changed or whatever. Trying to figure out how to get Medicare or Medicaid or something like that to pay for their therapy, right, is a make it or break it for a company in this space.
Mm-hmm. And what does that strategy typically, like, I guess if you're able to share, what does that strategy, payer adoption strategy often look like when you're working with the company?
Well, I haven't gone through it from start to finish, but I've talked to a number of companies who have done it. And they go into talks with the relevant government people and with the relevant corporations who, like, they talk to Blue Cross, they talk to Blue Shield, they talk about whether or not those companies would be willing to pay for their therapy because they're trying to convince, the powers that be that their therapy will save money on the insurance end, right?
Mhm.
And oftentimes they're successful in doing that, right? Like there's a number of like food companies and tracking companies and things like that where they've managed to get deals with some of the insurers or with government. And so that's a strategy I see fairly frequently when I'm looking at companies in this space. I guess that's the low-hanging fruit for them. But it would be nice if there were other options open. And so I think that's what you're looking at. Other options, I mean, to help get these therapies on the market.
Mhm.
I put a question in the chat. I'll repeat it here in case it gets missed. This was a very specific recommendation by one of our interviewees. He said it would help a lot if the short physical performance battery, which is a specified set of tests that doctors can do in the office, if CMS, that's the government agency that reimburses for Medicaid, Medicare, if they would reimburse for that test. And he explained why that was a good idea, but I just want to see, it struck me, wow, that's very specific. And it sounded very convincing to me. If anybody has yays or nays on that, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say.
I like that idea. I think that's a good idea.
Thank you.
Because it's kind of a proof of concept. I'll just continue on this. It's like the biomarker concept, right? Or the functional, as Larry was saying, the functional test. I mean, it's something that you can go to say, look, this therapy is working.
And apparently there's great science behind it. It's really a great test, and it's very simple, cheap too.
It's simple, it's cheap, exactly. You don't have to go through trials to see if this works or whatever. We already know it does. And so it baby steps us actually towards the larger biomarkers.
Yeah.
It's even better if you can show them, show insurance companies that the test will save them money.
Yes, for sure.
Mhm. Mhm.
We have Caliban making a comment on this. I'm sure I'm going to say it's here. Okay, well, we have a lot of support, at least in the chat as well. Okay, we have 4 more minutes, so really not very much time. And, I guess, as we said at the beginning, this is like a very soft launch of the kind of, research phase. Obviously, Kalon and Tom have done a lot of work already, but it's more like, an invitation for you guys to contribute. But yeah, we would absolutely love to hear your suggestions. And so in the last 4 minutes, I don't know, Kalon and Tom, if you want to get a specific point home, or if you want like feedback on a like specifically, pressing question, I think now is a good time to.
Well, I'll just say this. Hi, Greg Fahey. I mentioned, Greg, I don't know if you know this, that I'm here at the intervene offices today doing my follow-up testing. And I was intrigued to hear, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit I didn't know this, that I think one of the speakers credited Greg's team with getting the FDA to buy a multi-factor kind of set of indices of aging as something that they're measuring for their clinical trial that I'm in now. And I'll just, we maybe we don't want to take this up now, Greg, but Kalon and I have to interview you. We got to interview you. We got to hear more about that.
I'd be happy to talk to you, Tom, and thanks for participating in the trial. It was fun having you in the trial.
Thank you. I wish I could say it was fun, but I'm glad I did it.
Right, exactly.
I think it will be fun in hindsight. Well, maybe Kalon and Tom, if you want to share, just you already said that people can put their email address in the chat here. But is there a website or a specific thing if people are excited about contributing where they can go to? Should I send a follow-up email in the email afterwards, or what's the best way?
Yeah, just I think for me and probably for Tom, reaching out directly via email would probably be the best way to reach us.
Okay, wonderful. Then I will take the last 2 minutes to share a little bit kind of exciting housekeeping. So we have a ton of really interesting events that I think should be of interest to you guys coming up. And with events that also mean opportunities. One is applications for the 2023 fellowship are open now. You can take a look at all of our previous cohorts of our mentors, and you can apply here on the website. We have the different categories that we service, like the biotech one, which is where you're in, but also molecular nanotechnology, computing, neurotech, space, and a more existential hope, long-termist focused category. So please do that. You're welcome to nominate folks as well. And these fellowships are usually for us a great way to help individual people along through one-on-one mentorship connections, travel paid invitations to our events, and presentations to groups like this. And then the second thing is that I want to draw your guys' attention to is Vision Weekend is coming up. Vision Weekend is our annual member gathering. And like last year, it will be in a castle in France. It will be in San Francisco. And so if you're interested in taking a look, the tickets are available from starting today. We have a ton of speakers, over 50 presenters, and it's usually a good opportunity to meet people not only in your cohort, but in other cohorts as well. So basically across different technology groups that we have at Foresight. And yeah, we have a ton of really fun people already confirmed, including many people here in this group. We have really wonderful locations. There's an application form and a sponsorship form, so both options are available. And we'd love to see you there, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in San Francisco. Those events are usually, I think, my favorite event of the year. I'm very biased, but it's a good opportunity to meet other people in this group and across different groups. Okay, that's all for me. I'm going to follow up with anything that Tom and Kalon sent me. Really excited that you're starting this project, and I can't wait to hear where this will hopefully advance the field to. So thanks everyone for joining, and I'll see you very soon for the next one.